And we're live for gang. I'm still a hard man. Let's go. And we are live for the ancient Celts. Mysterious people who hardly left any writing. They actually did have a writing script, but it was adapted from the Etruscan script, I believe, or some Northern Italic script. But anyways, not all of the Celts were literate until probably the arrival of Christianity or the legions, regarding which part of the Celtic place that they were at the time. So anyways, yeah, so this is life in ancient Celtic times. Life in ancient Celtic times. So how are y'all doing? I am going into my medieval unit, and I will be discussing some of the barbarians of the late Iron Age and the early medieval period today. It might not be too long, but we'll see. We'll see where it goes. So anyways, yeah. I'll be making quite a bit of an emphasis on Britain and Ireland. England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland overwhelmingly. But that was not the only place that the Celts lived in Europe. The Celts also lived in Spain, Portugal, northern Portugal and Spain, Gaul, Switzerland, Austria, southern Germany, and going a bit into Romania, and even into Asia Minor. There was a place called Galatia in Asia Minor that was also settled by the Celts. I've also heard rather awkward rumors that the Celts also lived in Tulcheria. The ancient Tulcherians were Celtic. I'm not too sure about that. Some of the textile manufactured wares of the Celts and the Tulcherians were very, very much similar to one another, but it's actually quite impossible to really pinpoint if the Tulcherians were Celtic or not. More than likely, the Tulcherians were a branch of Iranians that lived in northern China. I won't be talking about them. I'll just be more so talking about the northern European Celts. Very mysterious people. A lot has been written about them, but there's also a lot of stuff that's not known about the Celts. They are a very mystical, very mysterious, and kind of just almost, I would say almost this, and the Romans had a lot to do with this too, exotic people and stuff, kind of like how later medieval authors would write about the Vikings. The Celts were known to be very exotic, very mysterious people, fearless warriors, but the Druids, it was believed that the mystical practices of the Druids included human sacrifice and cannibalism and just all sorts of these weird but exotic practices that stunned Greeks and Romans and the early Christians when they started to go up into the Celtic world. Here is an interesting fact. Gildas, Saint Gildas, the 6th century Briton or Welshman who wrote about the ruin of Britain, he was actually the first historian of Northern Europe, or the first historian that was from north of the Alps, at least from Britain anyways, at least from like the North Atlantic region. I don't know. There might have been a few Gallo-Roman writers that predated Gildas, but as far as I'm aware, Gildas is the first historian and the first scholar, not from Southern Europe or from like the Mediterranean or from Gaul, from an intermediate zone, but from the Atlantic world, to actually write and compile a book called The Ruin of Britain, in which he talks about a mythical king or a mythical ruler named Arthur, King Arthur. But none of the medieval legends and medieval stories that later became attributed to King Arthur were actually written. He was just a mysterious warrior saint that managed to prevail and turn back the Saxon invasions. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. I'm going to go check my laundry right fast and see if I'm finished. So usually, when it comes to the ancient barbarians, the ancient barbarian tribes, they'll say that Celts lived more to the west. And at least for the Romans, the northern barbarians were Celtic. For the Greeks, it was more the Scythians. The Scythians from the Pannonian Plains and from sort of the northern Balkans, basically what is now Poland. That was considered by the ancient Greeks to be the homeland of the Scythians, or the Scythian homeland. So anyways, I'll go ahead and just kind of start, and people can come in and chip in if they want to. I'm going to go ahead and check and see if my stream is live or not. It looks like I'm having some bad internet reception or bad Wi-Fi reception. It's the Wi-Fi though. I'm just going to check and see that for sure. And then I'll go ahead and get started into this stuff. So the title of the video is Ancient Celtic Life. Life among the ancient Celts. And I'm just going to go to my channel right fast and just make sure that everything is going good in that department. The Celts, at least with the Romans, the Celts tended to be the most well-known of the barbarians on the periphery of the civilized world. Much more earlier compared to other barbarians. The Celts were much longer exposed to Greek and Roman culture. And Roman culture. Okay, it's working. We're good. All right. So the Celts of all the at least the Central European tribes in Austria and Switzerland and Southern Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, um, the Celts had the longest exposure to Greek and Roman cultural exchange. The Greeks settled in Marseille. They founded a city known as now known as Marseille in southern Gaul, and that was the first real exposure, at least of the Gauls, to civilization. The Gauls were also conquered in the first century BC by the Romans, and so the Gauls, at least for the longest time with the Spaniards, were exposed to civilization and to Roman culture a lot longer compared to other more further out regions of Europe. So, anyways, I will chiefly be talking about Celtic Britain and Celtic Ireland, also known as Britain and Ireland of the Iron Age in this presentation. So let's just go ahead and get started. And we can just begin. And I'll start by Life in Prehistoric England by Tim Lambert. Stone Age Hunters. The first people lived in England at about 450,000 BC. At that time, England was much warmer than it is today. Animals like elephants, lions, and rhinoceros lived in England alongside deer, horses, bears, and wolves. Humans made simple stone tools and lived in caves. In 15,000 BC, people were still living in caves, but they made much more sophisticated tools of bone and stone. They also made clothes from animal skins, and they made jewelry of animal teeth and shells. These early people hunted animals like horses, deer, and wild cattle. In those days, England was covered in tundra, but about 8,500 BC, the climate grew much warmer. Forests spread across England. At the same time, England was cut off from Europe. In 7,500 BC, a group of humans lived at Starcar in Yorkshire. They were hunter-gatherers. They hunted deer, wild cattle, pigs, and elk. They also ate birds, fish, and shellfish. By this time, humans had also domesticated dogs. They also made boats. Stone Age farmers. Then, in 4,500 BC, agriculture was introduced into England. Using stone axes, the farmers began clearing forests that covered England. They grew crops of wheat and barley, and they raised herds of cattle, pigs, and sheep. However, as well as farming, they also hunted animals, such as deer, horses, and wild boar, and smaller animals such as beavers, badgers, and hares. They also gathered fruit and nuts. At the same time, the early farmers mined flint for making tools. They dug shafts, some of them 15 meters, 50 feet deep. They used deer antlers as picks and oxen shoulder blades as shovels. They also made pottery vessels, but they still wore clothes made from skins. They erected simple wooden huts to live in. The early farmers made elaborate tombs for their dead. They dug burial chambers, then lined them with wood or stone. Over them, they created mounds of earth called barrows. Some of these barrows still survive. From about 2,500 BC in England, the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, farmers made circular monuments called hinges. At first, they were simple ditches with stones or wooden poles erected in them. The most famous hinge is, of course, Stonehenge. It began as a simple ditch with an internal bank of earth. Outside the entrance stood the heel stone. The famous circle of stones were erected hundreds of years later. Stonehenge was altered and added to over 1,000-year period from 2250 to 1250 BC before it was finished and came into its final complete state. So that's Stonehenge. After 2500 BC, a new culture had spread across England. The inhabitants are known as the Beaker people because of the pottery beakers they made. They were bell-shaped and were often decorated with bone or cords. However, it is not known if the Beaker people were a new race who migrated to England from Europe, or if the people of England simply adopted a new culture. Bronze Age England. At any rate, by 2000 BC, English society was changed by the invention of bronze. Metal artifacts appeared in England as early as 2700 BC, although it is believed they were imported. By about 2000 BC, bronze was being made in England. Bronze is made of 9 parts copper and 1 part tin. It is, of course, harder than stone and provided more efficient tools and weapons. The Bronze Age people also rode horses, and they were the first people in England to weave cloth. Bronze Age women held their hair with bone pins, and they wore crescent-shaped necklaces. In the late Bronze Age, 1000 BC to 650 BC, forts were built on hills, so warfare was, it seems, becoming more common. This may have been because the population was rising and fertile land was becoming harder to obtain for warring bands of chieftains. For the warring bands of chieftains. Meanwhile, the Bronze Age people continued to build barrows, although cremation was practiced. The dead were buried with useful artifacts. Presumably, the living believed the dead would need these in the afterlife. Unfortunately, since they had no written records, nothing is known about this Bronze Age religion. So what I can tell you about the Bronze Age religion is there is a lot of worship of this water goddess. In the Bronze Age, there is a very strong veneration of water and the sort of sacred necessity of water and the sun. And after the collapse of the Bronze Age, this type of strong emphasis on the worship of water and this goddess of water was largely abandoned for the Celtic pantheon of gods in the Iron Age. We know that Bronze Age people lived in round wooden huts with thatched roofs, but nothing is known about their society or how it was organized. However, there were almost certainly different classes by that time. Tin and copper were exported from Britain along with animal hides. Jet and amber were imported for the rich. Then finally, we reach life in Celtic times. Life in Celtic times. The Celts, or the Celts as we know them, only really started to come along during the Iron Age, 650 BC and onwards, from the first, what was known as the Hallstatt culture, which arose in the mines of Austria and spread out from Austria and southern Germany and the later Latin culture that emerged from Celtic trade with Greek Marseilles and spread out throughout the Celtic Atlantic world from there. So, life in Celtic times. Then, about 650 BC, iron was introduced into England by a people called the Celts, and the first swords were made. Warfare was common during the Iron Age, and many hill forts, fortified settlements were built at that time, although there were also many open villages and farms. The Celts fought from horses or light wooden chariots. They threw spears and fought with swords. The Celts had wooden shields, and some wore chain mail. Most of the Celts were farmers, although there were also many highly skilled craftsmen. Some Celts were blacksmiths, working with iron, bronze smiths, carpenters, leather workers, and potters. The potter's wheel was introduced into Britain circa 150 BC. Celtic craftsmen also made elaborate jewelry of gold and precious stones. Furthermore, objects like swords and shields were often finely decorated. The Celts decorated metal goods with enamel. The Celts also knew how to make glass, and they made glass beads. Celtic society was hierarchical. At the top was a class of nobles headed by a king or chieftain. Below them were the craftsmen, of whom metal workers were the most important. Then came the farmers, who provided the food supply and also fought for the chief. There was also a class of slaves in Celtic England. However, the Celts were divided into tribes. There was no political unity among them, and a great deal of fighting between the tribes and other rivals. And this is an example of an Iron Age Celtic shield. The inscriptions and ensigns look very Gaelic. Trade with Europe was common. Metals like copper, tin, iron, and lead were exported from England. Wool, cloth, skins, and grain were also exported. Luxury goods like fine pottery and expensive metal goods were imported from Europe. At first, the Celts used iron bars as a form of currency, but by about roughly 50 BC, they were using gold coins. The Celts lived in round houses. They were built around a central pole with horizontal poles radiating outwards from it. They rested on vertical poles. Walls were of wattle and daub, and roofs were thatched. Around the walls inside the huts were benches, which also doubled up as beds. The Celts also used low tables. Celtic men wore tunics and trousers, and women wore long dresses and mantles. They used bronze mirrors. Women wore belts around their dresses made of cloth, leather, or bronze rings. Celtic men soaked their hair in lime water to make it stand up straight. They wore mustaches but not beards. Wealthy Celts wore gold ornaments around their necks called torques or torques. The Celts made dyes from plants, woad for blue, madder for red, and weld for yellow. For amusement, Celts played board games. They were also very fond of music and played flutes and lyres. In good weather, they held horse or chariot races. The Celts also enjoyed hunting wild boar on horseback. The Celts had priests called Druids. The Druids were very important in Celtic society. As well as being priests, they were scholars, judges, and advisors to the kings. The Celts were polytheists. They worshipped many gods and goddesses. They did not build temples, but instead worshipped at natural sites, such as groves of trees, springs, rivers, and lakes. Sometimes the Celts sacrificed valuable goods by throwing them into lakes and rivers. In Celtic times, the practice of building barrows died out. Instead, people were interned in individual graves. They were still buried with grave goods, showing the Celts had a strong belief in an afterlife. They believed that when you died, your spirit went to a place called the other world. The Romans later claimed the Druids practiced human sacrifice, but this claim is doubtful or dubious at best. The main Celtic festivals were Imbolc at the beginning of February, at the start of the lambing season, Beltane at the beginning of May, when cattle were sent out to graze in the fields after being kept indoors and fed on hay during the winter. Lothnazat, Luthnazat, in August, where the crops were growing ripe, and Samhain at the beginning of November. That was the time when animals were brought in from the fields for the winter. The Celts did not grow enough hay to feed them all, so those not needed for breeding were slaughtered. The Celts grew crops in rectangular fields. They raised pigs, sheep, and cattle. They stored grain in pits lined with stone or wicker and sealed with clay. The Celts also brewed beer from barley, and they were very heavy drinkers at that. Very heavy drinkers, too. So this is Celtic Daily Life by Tim Lambert, localhistories.org, Celtic Daily Life. Celtic warfare. In about 650 BC, the Celts introduced iron into Britain, and they made the first swords in the British Isles. Warfare was common during the Iron Age, and many hill forts, fortified settlements were built at that time, although there were many open villages and farms. The Celts fought from horses or light wooden chariots. They threw spears and fought with swords. The Celts had wooden shields, and some wore chainmail. All right, let's see here. Celtic homes. I already read about Celtic society. So most of the Celts were farmers, but many were also very skilled craftsmen. The Celts had some of the best craftsmen in Iron Age Europe or ancient Europe. Some Celts were blacksmiths, bronzesmiths, carpenters, leather workers, and potters. The potter's wheel was introduced into Britain in 150 BC. Celtic craftsmen made elaborate jewelry of gold and precious stones. Let's see here. Trade with Europe was common. Metals like copper, tin, iron, and lead were exported from England. Wool, cloth, skins, and grain were also exported. Luxury goods like fine pottery and expensive metal goods were imported from Europe. At first, the Celts used iron bars as a form of currency, but by 50 BC they were using gold coins. Celtic homes. The Celts lived in round houses. They were built around a central pole with horizontal poles radiating outwards from it. They rested on vertical poles. Walls were of wattle and dom, and roofs were thatched. Around the walls inside the huts there were benches, which also doubled up as beds. The Celts also used low tables. Celtic clothes. Celtic men wore tunics and trousers, and women wore long dresses and mantles. They used bronze mirrors. Women wore belts around their dresses made of cloth, leather, or bronze rings. Celtic men soaked their hair in lime water to make it stand up straight. They wore mustaches but not beards. Wealthy Celts wore gold ornaments around their necks called torques or tarcos. The Celts made dyes from plants, woad for blue, madder for red, and wild for yellow. All right, let's see here. I think I already read all of this. Yeah. Celtic games. For amusement, Celts played board games. They were also very fond of music and played flutes and lyres. In good weather, they held horse or chariot races. The Celts also enjoyed hunting wild boars on horseback. Celtic religion, and this is dyer's woad, which was used to make blue. Celtic religion. The Celts had a class of priests called Druids. The Druids were very important in Celtic society. As well as being priests, they were scholars, judges, and advisors to the kings. The Celts were polytheists. They worshipped many gods and goddesses. They did not build temples, but instead worshipped at natural sites, such as groves of trees, springs, rivers, and lakes. Sometimes the Celts sacrificed valuable goods by throwing them into lakes and rivers. In Celtic times, the old practice of building burrows to bury the dead died out. Instead, people were interned in individual graves. They were still buried with grave goods, showing the Celts had a strong belief in the afterlife. They believed that when you died, your spirit went to a place called the other world. The Romans claimed the Druids practiced human sacrifice, but this claim was very dubious. The main Celtic festivals were Imbolc at the beginning of February at the start of the lambing season, Beltane at the beginning of May, when cattle were sent out to graze in the fields after being kept indoors and fed on hay during the winter, Lughnasadh in August, Lughnasadh in August when the crops were growing ripe, and Samhain at the beginning of November. That was the time when animals were brought in from the fields for the winter. The Celts did not grow enough hay to feed them all, so those animals not needed for breeding were slaughtered. And this is Boudica, Boudica, a Celtic queen of the Iceni. Although the Romans regarded the Celts as barbarians, they created a sophisticated and advanced society. Women certainly had more freedom than in Roman society, and Celtic craftsmen were superb. Most of the Celts were farmers there was also many skilled craftsmen. Some were blacksmiths, bronzesmiths, carpenters, leather workers, and potters. Celtic craftsmen made elaborate jewelry of gold and precious stones. Objects like swords and shields were finely decorated. The Celts decorated metal with enamel. The Celts also knew how to make glass, and they made glass beads. At the top of Celtic society was a class of nobles headed by a king or chieftain. Below them were the craftsmen, of whom metal workers were the most important. Then came the farmers, who provided the food supply and also fought for the chief. However, the Celts were divided into tribes. There was no political unity among them and a great deal of fighting. The Celts grew crops in rectangular fields. They raised pigs, sheep, and cattle. They stored grain in pits lined with stone or wicker and sealed with clay. The Celts also brewed beer from barley. All right, so next. All right, can you guys hear me, by the way? You guys can hear me, right? All right, so this is thoughtco.com, Beginner's Guide, European Iron Age. So, the European Iron Age by Chris Hurst. The European Iron Age, which is from circa 800 to 51 BC, is what archaeologists have called that period of time in Europe when the development of complex urban societies was spurred by intensive manufacturing of bronze and iron and extensive trading in and out of the Mediterranean basin. At that time, Greece was flourishing, and the Greeks saw an explicit division between the cultured peoples of the Mediterranean as compared to the barbaric northerners of Central, Western, and Northern Europe. Some scholars have argued that it was Mediterranean demand for exotic goods that drove the interaction and led to the growth of an elite class in the hill forts of Central Europe. Hill forts, fortified settlements located on the tops of hills above Europe's major rivers, became numerous during the early Iron Age, and many of them do show the presence of imported Mediterranean goods. European Iron Age dates are traditionally set between the approximate period when iron became the principal tool-making material and the Roman conquests of the late 1st century BC. Iron production was first established during the late Bronze Age, but did not become widespread in Central Europe until 800 BCE, and in Northern Europe by 600 BCE. Chronology of the Iron Age, 800 to 450 BC. Early Iron Age, Hallstatt period. The early part of the Iron Age is called the Hallstatt culture, and it was during this time in Central Europe that elite chiefs rose into power, perhaps as a direct result of their connections to the Mediterranean Iron Age of classical Greece and the Etruscans. Hallstatt chiefs built or rebuilt a handful of hill forts in eastern France and southern Germany and maintained an elite lifestyle. Hallstatt sites are to be found at Huneberg, Hoheneisberg, Warsburg, Breisach, Vix, Hochdorf, Camp de Chessé, Montlausiers, Magdalenska Gora, and Vasse. All right, and this is a horse-drawn cart from the Hallstatt period. 450 to 50 BC, the late Iron Age, Latin. Between 450 and 400 BC, the Hallstatt elite system collapsed, and power shifted to a new set of people under what was at first a more egalitarian society. The Latin culture grew in power and wealth because of their location on important trade routes used by the Mediterranean Greeks and Romans to acquire status goods. References to Celts conflated with Gauls and meaning Central European barbarians came from the Romans and Greeks, and the Latin material culture is broadly agreed to represent those groups. Eventually, population pressure between the populous Latin zones forced younger Latin warriors out, beginning the massive Celtic migrations. Latin populations moved southward into Greek and Roman areas, conducting extensive and successful raids, even into Rome itself, and eventually including most of the European continent. A new settlement system, including central defended settlements called oppida, were located in Bavaria and Bohemia. These were not princely residences, but instead residential, commercial, industrial, and administrative centers that focused on trade and production for the Romans. Famous Latin sites can be found in the following areas. Hold on a second, dude. Yeah, go away. Okay, so Latin sites are to be found at Manchang, Grauberg, Kilhem, Singindunum, Stradonasi, Zavist, Bibtract, Taulus, and Rocupertusse. 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 Next, we have lifestyles of the Iron Age. In about 800 BC, most of the people in northern and western Europe were in farming communities, including the essential grain crops of wheat, barley, rye, oats, lentils, peas, and beans. Domesticated cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were used by Iron Age people. Different parts of Europe relied on different suits of animals and crops, and many places supplemented their diets with wild game and fish and nuts, berries and fruit. The first barley beer was produced. Villages were small, usually under 100 people in residence, and the homes were built of wood with sunken floors and wattle and daub walls. It was not until near the end of the Iron Age that larger, town-like settlements began to appear. Most communities manufactured their own goods for trade or use, including pottery, beer, iron tools, weapons, and ornaments. Bronze was most popular for personal ornaments. Wood, bone, antler, stone, textiles, and leather were also used. Trade goods between communities included bronze, Baltic amber, and glass objects, and grinding stones in places far from their sources of originality. Social change in the Iron Age. By the late 6th century BC, construction had begun on fortresses on the tops of hills. Building within the Hallstatt hill forts was quite dense, with rectangular timber-framed buildings built close together. Below the hilltop and outside the fortifications lay extensive suburbs. Cemeteries had monumental mounds with exceptionally rich graves, indicating social stratification. The collapse of the Hallstatt elites saw the rise of Latin egalitarians. Features associated with Latin include inhumation burials and the disappearance of the elite tumulus-style burials. Also indicated is a rise in the consumption of millet, panicum millicium, panicum millicium. The 4th century BC began the outmigration of small groups of warriors from the Latin heartland towards the Mediterranean Sea. These groups waged terrific raids against the inhabitants. One result was the discernible drop in the population at early Latin sites. Beginning in the middle of the 2nd century BC, connections with the Mediterranean Roman world steadily increased and appeared to stabilize. New settlements such as Fidersine-Werda became established as production centers for Roman military bases, marking the traditional end of what archaeologists consider the Iron Age. Caesar conquered Gaul in 51 BC, and within a century, Roman culture became established in Central Europe up to the Rhine and Danube. So, are there any questions about what I've read? Also, it's important to note that Celtic culture didn't just exist in the Iron Age. Celtic culture and Celtic influences thrived in Roman Britain and also in sub-Roman Britain, and even for a time coexisted with the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse. The so-called Norse Gaels of Ireland was a hybrid culture of the Celts and the Norse. And Celtic culture continued well into the Middle Ages. It was only in about the 8th, 9th, and the 10th and 11th centuries that Celtic culture formally died in the Celtic fringe of the British Isles, actually. All right, I don't know if I'm going to be able to read all of that, so I'll skip that for now. All right, so this is Celtic trivia. How much do you think that you might know about the Celts or the Celts? These are interesting facts about the ancient Celts. Land, people, and language. The ancient Celts were a branch of the Indo-Europeans, an ethno-linguistic group that also included Germanic, Slavic, Greek, and Indo-Iranian people. From their homeland in the Pontic-Caspian steppes, the Proto-Indo-Europeans went on to conquer most of Europe, Central Asia, and South Asia from 4000 BCE onwards, thanks to the advent of the Bronze Age in the North Caucasus. Proto-Celtic people arrived from the Balkans to Central Europe around 2500 BCE, equipped with horses and superior bronze weapons. The Celts quickly conquered Western Europe from Iberia to the British Isles. Classical Celtic culture emerged in Central Europe around modern Austria, Bavaria, and Switzerland. The earliest major Celtic settlement, dating from 1200 BCE, was found in Hallstatt, Upper Austria. The classical Hallstatt culture and its successor, the egalitarian Latin culture, spread from the Alps to most of Western and Central Europe between 600 and 400 BCE. People in those areas spoke a similar language, shared a similar religion, similar traditions and beliefs, the same arts and techniques of metalcraft. There were some minor regional differences between Celtic people. For example, houses in Britain and Ireland were typically round, while those in Gaul were rectangular. The term Celt comes from Greek Keltoi or Galate, Galatian, and Latin Celte or Galli, Gaul. It is not known how they called themselves, and it is likely to have been a word in between those, maybe resembling the modern word Gael or Gael. Though the Celts did not have their own writing system, Celtic language inscriptions in Latin or Greek alphabets have been found on Celtic sites. Contrary to popular beliefs, Celtic languages were still spoken after the Roman conquest. Saint Jerome, who lived from 347 to 420, notes that the language of the Anatolian Galatians in his day were still very similar to the language of the Treveri from the region of Trier and the border of Germany and Luxembourg. Celtic languages progressively disappeared during the Middle Ages. They only survived in Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, as well as the Isle of Man, and for a time also in Galicia, northwestern Spain. Today, only a minority of people can still speak Celtic Gaelic languages, and they are mostly confined to Wales, Brittany, and Western Ireland. Genetic studies determined that most of the ancient Celtic men belonged to the Y-DNA haplogroup R1b subclad S116 and its subclads. Two early Bronze Age migrations brought the L21 subclad to northwest France and the British Isles, and the DF27 subclad to southwest France and Iberia. The third major Celtic subclad is S28, aka U152, which is associated with the expansion of the Hallstatt and Latin Celts, as well as with Italic tribes. Italic tribes. Celtic people are believed to have spread the genes for red hair. See the origins and history of red hair for more details. So this is the expansion of the Hallstatt and Latin cultures. This is a map of Celtic paternal lineages in modern Europe. This map represents the paternal lineages, Y chromosomal DNA associated with the spread of Proto-Italo-Celtic people from Central to Western Europe in the Bronze Age, starting circa 4,500 years ago. The Celtic lineages are the S116, P312 branch of the Indo-European haplogroup R1b, minus the Greco-Etruscan R1b L23, the Germanic R1b U106 and the R1b L238, and the Proto-Celto-Germanic L11, L51, and L150. S116 includes subclads associated with non-IE languages such as Basque and the ancient Gascon and Iberian languages, since it is unclear exactly when and where Celtic languages developed and whether some Proto-Celtic speakers might have adopted indigenous languages in the land they settled, especially in Gascony and Mediterranean Iberia. All lineages were included for the purpose of this map, giving priority to Y DNA over languages. So this is Italo-Celtic Y DNA percentages. Society, culture, and lifestyle. The Celts actively traded with the Mediterranean world, exchanging notably their iron tools and weapons for wine, pottery, and luxury imports. They also imported amber from the Baltic to resell to the Romans and Greeks. The Celts preempted the Romans in their construction of a road network across the European continent. The Celtic world was very decentralized compared to the Roman one, but at least a dozen Celtic towns possessed high stone walls rivaling those of Rome at the time. The longest were 5 kilometers long. Recent studies have shown that the Celts were more advanced than the Romans in some scientific and economic aspects. Pre-Roman Celtic calendars were much more accurate than the Roman one. In fact, they were possibly more accurate than the Gregorian calendar that we use nowadays. Each Galatian tribe was organized in 4 septs, clans, each ruled by a tetrarch, chief, assisted by a judge, a general, and 2 deputy generals. Each sept sent 25 senators to a central shrine called Drunamiton. The Celts were immensely rich. We now know that Julius Caesar's main reason to conquer Gaul was to lay hands on Celtic gold. Over 400 Celtic gold mines were found in France alone. The Romans had little gold on their home territory, so the conquest of Gaul, much like the later conquest of Syria and Egypt, was a tremendous boost to their power. The Celtic nobility was also known to be clean-shaven, with well-trimmed hair following the fashion of the time. Tweezers were also found on archaeological sites. Ancient Celtic society gave much more freedom and power to women than the Greeks and Romans did. Greco-Roman housewives were prohibited to do business and mostly sequestrated in their home under the supervision of male family members. Celtic women could sometimes become powerful tribe leaders and were also known to go to war. Celtic warfare and technology. The Celts invented the chain mail around 300 BCE and the helmets later used by Roman legionaries. Celtic swords and shields were at least as good as the Romans. The decoration of the Celtic weapons, chariots, and artifacts was in many ways superior to those of many Mediterranean cultures. Gauls at the time of Julius Caesar were described as wearing shiny gold-like armors and swords. The Celts' early development of prime iron weapons and armory gave them a military advantage over the neighbors. It permitted them to conquer and subdue most of Europe for many centuries. The Celts had a reputation of fearsome barbarians among the Greeks and the Romans. Around 400 BCE, they seized the territory that lay between the Apennine Mountains and the Alps, i.e., northern Italy, then went on to plunder Rome in 390 BCE. Even Alexander the Great made sure of avoiding war with the Celts, eagerly signing a peace treaty with them in 335 BCE, before embarking on his conquest of Persia. After his death, the Celts became a threat for the Greeks again. Lured by the wealth accumulated in Greek temples by Alexander, the Galatian Celts invaded Macedonia in 281 BCE and sacked Delphi in 279 BCE. Their defeat against the Romans was mainly due to the fact that they were disunited against the Roman enemy and victims of internal tribal struggles. It is estimated that Julius Caesar massacred 1 out of 10 million of the Celts in Gaul, 1/10 of the population, and put another million into slavery. In modern times, that would be called a genocide. So there's an example of there's an example of some of the Gaelic wars of the 50s BC. Religion and beliefs. Like the Greeks, Romans, Germans, and Hindus, the Celts were polytheists, and divinities varied from region to region, with a few major gods like Lugh recognized everywhere. Like the Romans, the Celts did not hesitate to venerate foreign gods as well. Druids were not only priests, diviners, and astronomers, they were also judges, mediators, and political advisors who played an important role in declarations of war or peace. It took about 20 years of formation to become a druid. Like the Christian clergy in the Middle Ages, Druids were usually from noble extraction and trained from boyhood. Druidism might have originated in Britain. Nevertheless, Druids held their great annual assembly in the territory of the Carnutes in central Gaul. Oaks were of primordial importance in Celtic religion. Druids ritually cut mistletoe off oak trees. The word druid is related to the Celtic term for oak, and the gathering place for Galatian druids was called Drunamiton, literally oak sanctuary. The Celts practiced ritual human sacrifice to the gods, typically near water, a lake, river, or spring, or in a forest or in forest groves. Victims were most often war prisoners or criminals, druids being both judges and priests. It was a way of combining judicial or military executions with the honoring of the gods. The Celts did not believe in heaven or hell, but believed in automatic reincarnation on earth, regardless of one's deeds in life. Greek writers recall that when meeting Alexander the Great, the Celts boasted that they feared nothing unless it was that heavens might fall on them, unless it were that the heavens might fall on them. Celtic warriors decapitated the defeated after a battle, took the heads back home as trophies, and exposed the headless bodies hanging in wooden frames. Sometimes they replaced humans by large amphoras of wine and simulated the decapitation by cutting off the top of the amphora with a sword. The spilling wine would represent the blood. One of the most prominent Celtic deity in Gaul and Britain was Lugis or Luv in Irish mythology, whose great shrine was at Lundunum, modern Lyon, patron of trade and commerce, protector of travelers, and the inventor of all the arts. Lug's attributes identify him as the equivalent of the Roman god Mercury or the Greek god Hermes. Lug's feast was celebrated on 1st August. His symbol is the crow. The Celts compared to the Greeks and Romans. Greco-Roman writers typically tell horrified accounts of the barbarous Celtic practice of human and animal sacrifice. Nevertheless, both Greeks and Romans sacrificed animals to the gods, and sometimes even humans, as did King Agamemnon with his daughter. The Romans also famously organized games in which human beings fought each other in arenas to death for the pleasure of spectators. Furthermore, the Romans crucified political opponents and had prisoners killed or eaten alive by wild beasts in arenas. Overall, Celtic religious sacrifices were certainly less cruel and barbaric than what the Romans did. The Celts didn't put water into their wine, which was seen as a barbaric practice by the Greeks and the Romans. The Celtic way is the one that prevailed in modern times, though, as it may not be that barbaric after all. Tribes and place names. Many ancient Celtic tribes gave their names to modern places. For example, Bohemia was named after the Boii, and Belgium after the Belgae. The ancient name of Switzerland, still occasionally used nowadays, was Helvetia, from the Celtic Helvetii tribe. In France, Paris itself was named after the Parisi tribe, and Lyon is a corruption of the Celtic name Lugdunum, Lugdunon, Lugdunon, meaning the hill fort of Lugh, one of the most important Celtic deities. There are numerous cities and regions in France named after Gaulish or Belgic tribes, for example. A Cisalpine branch of the above-mentioned Veneti tribe, their name gave their name to Venice and the Veneto region in Italy, the Italian cities of Belluno, Bergamo, Bologna, Brescia, Brianza, Genova, and Milano all have Celtic and Latin roots. In Germany, Trier, Treviers in French, was named after the Treveri tribe. The German cities or towns of Ansbach, Bonn, Bompard, Durin, Kempten, Mainz, Rimingen, and Tübingen all have a Celtic etymology. A few Belgian towns are named after Belgic tribes, such as Tongeren, Tongres, named after the Tungri, Minin, named after the Menapi, and Verton, named after the Viromandui. The name of the villages of Havendoren, Tianin, and Avernais, Hanut, may derive from the Aberones tribe, Aberones tribe. Additionally, the Condroz and Famine regions of Wallonia owe their name to the Belgic Condrusi and Pyamani tribes. The Swiss towns and cities of Solothurn, Thun, Wunterthur, Vanterthur, Yeverdon, Lesbiens, and Zurich have Celtic etymologies. As do Bregenz and Vienna in Austria. The name Portugal comes from the Latin Portis Calais, port of Calais. Calais, or Caialia, was the mother goddess of the Celtic people. Many Portuguese towns, Ankh cities, have Celtic names coinciding, including Beira, Braga, Braganca, Coimbra, Evora, as well as the ancient Roman cities of Coimbriga and Lacobriga. The regions of Galicia in northwest Spain, Galicia in Central Eastern Europe, straddling between Poland and Ukraine, as well as the city and county of Galati in Romania, all derive their name from the Galatians. Many European rivers have Celtic names. The Celtic word Danube, meaning to flow, is the root of some of the longest European rivers, like the Danube, Don, Dnieper, and Dniester. Other river names with a Celtic origin include the Douro in Iberia, the Dordogne, Lier, Meuse, Rhône, and Seine in France, the Main, and Neckar in Germany, or the Avon, Thames, and Trent in Britain. So, and these are just some names of modern areas and places all over France and Europe in general that their names originally come from a Celtic tribe. And of course, how would I be so blunt as to not talk about life in Gaelic Ireland. So let's talk a bit about Gaelic Ireland. Life in Iron Age Ireland, if I can find it. Let's see here. Iron Age Ireland. Um, so this is at wesleyjohnston.com. And this is Life in Celtic Ireland. The arrival of the Celts. As the Bronze Age in Ireland drew to a close, there appeared in Ireland a new cultural influence. Developing in the Alps and Central Europe, the Celts spread their culture across modern-day Germany and France and into the Balkans as far as Turkey. They arrived in Britain and Ireland around 500 BC, and within a few hundred years, Ireland's Bronze Age culture had all but disappeared, and Celtic culture was in place. So I'm actually going to save this for another historical thing. When I do the history of Ireland, I'm going to save that for a history of Ireland course. But yeah, there's also this thing called the P and Q Gaelic. There's P Gaelic and Q Gaelic. Or apparently the P Celtic languages is where Brittonic comes from, and the Q Celtic is where Scottish and Irish Gaelic comes from. So this is gotoireland.com, culture, the Iron Age in Ireland. The Iron Age in Ireland, an era of profound transformations and cultural richness, introduced by the Celtic invasions of the time. The Iron Age in Ireland is a historical period that began around 500 BC. It marks a period of great cultural and technological change. This era saw the introduction of iron technology, bringing advances in the manufacture of tools and weapons. It coincides with the arrival of the Celts, who profoundly influenced Irish culture, language, and society. This period is also characterized by the construction of impressive structures, such as stone forts and burial mounds, and by a society organized into clans and kingdoms, a pivotal period that laid the foundations of Ireland's cultural identity, past as well as present. The Irish Iron Age. Technological, cultural, and social upheaval. The Iron Age remains a crucial period in Irish history. It is characterized by major technological and cultural changes made possible by the arrival of the Gaels, a Celtic people who colonized the island over several centuries. Their arrival in Ireland had a profound impact on the island and its society. Their language, beliefs, artistic practices, and social structures have strongly influenced the development of Irish cultural identity. This is a Celtic Warrior in Ireland by Jeff Witt. Progress during the Irish Iron Age. Here is an overview of the progress made during this period. Iron technology. The use of iron to make tools, weapons, and household objects brought greater durability and efficiency than previous materials such as bronze. Agricultural improvements. The agricultural way of life during the Iron Age in Ireland was mainly based on livestock rearing, the cultivation of cereals such as barley and oats, and the production of milk and milk derivatives. Iron tools improved farming techniques, making soil cultivation more efficient. Open field systems, livestock enclosures, and crop storage techniques testify to a relatively advanced agricultural society. Hunting, fishing, and gathering also completed the diet of the people of this period. Building hill forts. The architecture evolved with the construction of stone forts and more elaborate defensive structures, such as ring forts. The stone forts built on the island bear witness to the skill and sophistication of the builders of the time. In addition, burial mounds and other funerary structures suggest complex beliefs about life after death and the role of ancestors in society. Arts and crafts. Metalworking reached a high level of sophistication, with jewelry and weapons adorned with intricate designs. Social and political structures. Social and political organization was influenced by the arrival of the Celts, leading to a system of clans and kingdoms. Their leaders, often considered semi divine, ruled their lands with absolute authority. The law of Brehon was also introduced, a sophisticated legal system based on customs and traditions that lasted until the 17th century, resisting various invasions and political changes in Ireland. Introduction of Irish Gaelic. Gaelic, also known as Irish, is a language that developed in Ireland during the Celtic invasions. These settlers then introduced their own language, laying the foundations for modern Gaelic. Over time, the language evolved and diversified, leading to the creation of several distinct dialects in Ireland. Introduction to Celtic music. The Iron Age was a major stage in the development of Irish Celtic music, although it's difficult to trace the precise origins of Celtic music in this period due to the lack of written documents. It's likely that the Celts, who arrived in Ireland in the Iron Age, brought their musical traditions with them. These innovations marked a significant transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. For historians, the progress made led to the modernization of everyday life at the time, bringing an entire population to a level of maturity never before achieved. A period of war. Although there is no concrete evidence of an exclusively warlike period, the Irish Iron Age was undoubtedly marked by conflicts and rivalries between different clans and kingdoms. Niall of the Nine Hostages is a famous legend that comes to mind about this period. At that time, the Celts were divided into different entities, and turf wars were a regular occurrence. What's more, the introduction of iron tools and weapons certainly enhanced the military capabilities of the time, taking confrontations to a new level of violence. This is evidenced by the presence of forts and defensive structures all over the island of Ireland. Imposing these constructions indicate a notable preoccupation of the population of the time for its security and defense. Development of new pagan beliefs. Ireland's Iron Age beliefs were strongly rooted in Celtic paganism. This polytheistic belief system worshipped a multitude of deities, often associated with natural elements such as water, trees, and animals. Druids played a key role as priests, advisors, and guardians of knowledge. They practiced rituals, sacrifices, and celebrations linked to seasonal cycles and natural events. Myths and legends, transmitted orally, were also central to their belief system, reflecting a world where the natural and the supernatural were closely intertwined. In conclusion, the Iron Age in Ireland was a period particularly rich in advances and progress, initiated by the arrival of the Celts. These innovations led to a highly codified society based on a class system, land cultivation, education, and power struggles. This period gave rise to Irish Gaelic, oral tradition, and Irish Celtic music, which is world famous. Let's see here. All right, so I'll tell you some stuff about Celtic Ireland. Let's see here. How far have I come on? An hour and 30 minutes. All right, so I'll do this another time. All right, so go ahead and stop the screen sharing. I believe Code of Truth was really waiting for me to cover this period of history, ancient and early medieval history, because a lot of the Celtic traditions and Celtic festivals and stuff, Code of Truth especially wanted to know a lot about it. And I think also so did Soulbreaker. So Code of Truth, I think, really got a lot of enjoyment on this. All right, so that was my life in ancient Celtic times, or the Celtic Iron Age of Europe and the early medieval period. At a later date, I will come back and talk about early Christian Britain and Ireland and Celtic Christianity. But probably I will go ahead and end this. So let's look at the comments. So yes, the Celts invented their own type of chainmail. It was actually the Assyrians that invented chainmail armor, but the Celts invented their own that the Romans later adapted into their own arsenal. Yeah, the Celts were very brutal warriors. They practiced headhunting and human sacrifice. The Druids are still a mystery even to this day. So, anyways, Code of Truth says Celtic peoples are the lost tribe, and they are not. Celtic people are not from Israel. They are from a Semitic tribe that went into Bronze Age Europe at some point after the events of the Tower of Babel. But they were Semitic, but they were not Israelites. Code of Truth says, "Awake, O Israel!" Exclamation mark. Hallelujah, hallelujah, praise the Lord. Soulbreaker says, please like and subscribe, guys. Yes, please do so. It helps to grow the channel. Krail says, good morning, Krail. Krill says, Forge Gang! Soulbreaker says, Forge Gang! Let's go! Krail says, there is a very interesting exchange of culture and religion that occurred between the Celtic and Egyptian people that is often unremarked upon. You know, I have heard about that. And I do think that the Celts had some contact with Hebrews and Egyptians and Carthaginians. I do think that the Celts did have some contact with those people of the Orient, but I don't necessarily believe that the Celts are a branch of Israel. But yes, unfortunately, this is beyond the discussion of this live stream. This is specifically about ancient Celtic life, and I can neither confirm nor deny that, Krill. Soulbreaker says Celtic people still exists, and they do. In northwestern Europe, the Irish, the Welsh, the Cornish, and the Scots, etc. And the some of the Normans, the Britons, and some of the Spaniards. Rick Perry says, Forge Gang! Hardman! Let's go! Forge Gang! Forge Gang! Forge Gang! Say it loud! Say it proud! Soulbreaker says, hard, huh? JK, Soulbreaker says, JK, Rick Perry gives the metal Metallica hand sign. These are not devil's horns, by the way. They're just Metallica. They're a Metallica hand sign from the 80s. Krill says, and at level 4, druids get access to wild form that lets them shapeshift. Yep. There is actually some Romans, including Julius Caesar and probably Alexander the Great, who probably thought that some of the druids knew how to shapeshift. The druids were pretty superstitious people, like most ancient people were. Most people in the ancient world were. Soulbreaker says, Ireland win. Soulbreaker says, yeah, yeah, yeah. Krail says, yep, sounds good. Krail mentions that Kitty Styles has been streaming on YouTube all day again. He already banned me, lol. Oh, really, dude? Isn't he kind of like a Norwegian version of Britbong? Krail says day. Soulbreaker says JK. Code of Truth says Celt power! Celtic pride, my brother. Celtic pride, bro. Soulbreaker says use AI voice IMAO. Okay. Interdimensional Lizard says all this stuff about female tribe leaders and warriors sounds like fanfic. It actually is not. Queen Boudica of the Iceni was a famous female warrior queen that rebelled against the Romans in 60 AD. And there's many other examples of female Celtic warriors. It's not a fanfic. It's very real. Females had a lot of freedom in Celtic society. That began to change as Christianity came along and the Celts started to become Christian, or they became Romanized. That started to change, but I think a lot of the female stuff was a lot to do with the Latin egalitarianization and break away from the former elitist Hallstatt period. The Hallstatt period was very elitist, and Latin was more accepting and egalitarian in that regard, including to women. Interdimensional Lizard says, but if true, maybe that was their downfall. Well, it's possible. I wouldn't doubt it. I wouldn't doubt it. Soulbreaker says, lol. A random person that nobody knows. Ooh, history, my favorite. Well, I'm glad you liked it. Soulbreaker says, win for the Forge. Krail says, yep, enjoyable stream. All right. I think I might do a part 2 where I will go a little bit deeper into some of the ancient Celtic stuff. But, anyways, that's going to be it for now. Thank you guys for coming and watching, and have a nice day. Forge Gang! I'm still a hard man. Let's go.